Hello and welcome to Varn Blog Solo. We're going to continue our discussion of the ancients. I'm still debating whether or not I'm going to cover Plato, which will screw up our chronological order because Plato, of course, becomes before and concurrent to Aristotle, depending on the time period you're talking about. But the reason why I started rethinking this was that the very focus on the polis and its relationship to the idea of politics as opposed to governments or kingship or sovereignty. You might go, well, those are all kind of synonyms. Not exactly, even in English, and definitely not in more ancient thought. The polis in modern Greek, is kind of like a municipal area. It's located within a country which provides a Petrodia, or a native land for the citizens of that country of which the polis is located, or the pole. And I'm going to butcher the Greek. I don't speak Demotic or Koine or Attic Greek, so none of our Greeks are covered here. But in the ancient world, there is no separation between the polis and the Cora, our country. All right. The polis was the native land. It was what you were attached to. Now, a polis contained a countryside, which it may be responsible for, and even maybe subordinate polises who were not sovereign. But in Greece, and in many places other than Greece, Carthage famously had a constitution which Aristotle covered, not even a Hellenistic or Hellene culture, that is Semitic culture in North Africa. But polises were bodies of government with varieties of governance that had metropolitan centers, urbanized centers, that also usually contained some kind of wall for retreat and fortification, and a constitution. Right? The idea of a constitution is that a document binds the rules of the polis and is the grant of law is one of the things that is important to Aristotle and is not totally unique, but definitely a huge part of Hellenistic culture. The center of the polis was called the metropolis, or the mother city. And the regions were often named after the mother city, and in fact, often the ethnic demarcations given to people were based off the mother city. The Athenians, metropolis was Athens. The Acarnanians, metropolis was Acarnania. The Spartans, metropolis, the Lacedaemonians, metropolis was Lacedaemonia, or Sparta. And the polises colonized smaller settlements, areas, etc., and even had far-flung, almost settler colonies in Anatolia and Northern Africa and Sicily, etc. And it's important to understand that when talking about political units in Aristotle. But this codification of governance as being by the polis also comes from Plato. In fact, the Republic's Latin name is a play on polis. It's, the Republic is the Latin name of the Greek name, which is a play on polis, which would be like the Politeia. All right. Now, Aristotle is responding a lot to ideas in the Politeia. The reason why I didn't want to deal with Plato's Republic or the Politeia is there's a lot of esoteric elements to it, and there's a great debate on what you're supposed to read metaphorically or literally. Even in the ancient world, there's a big debate about that. The Neoplatonists interpret it very different than the Middle Platonists, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas politics for Aristotle is a lot clearer. And the Politica, which is the main political work, is kind of a collection of notes and essays and all kinds of stuff put together about politics from Aristotle. We don't have Aristotle's dialogues, his complete dialectical works. He apparently did write them. What we have are notes from lecture. So while Aristotle is super important, what we have maintained from him are not stuff that was actually meant for polemic consumption, the way we do have the dialogues from Plato. Make of that what you will. Now, we have to kind of get to the context of Aristotle before we get into this as well. But Aristotle was a polymath. I mean, he was considered like the philosopher and authority on pretty much everything almost into the 19th century in the West. He was the founder of the Lyceum, which was a competitor school based in Athens when he was not appointed the head of the academy, which was Plato's grouping. According to Diogenes Laertius, who is, of questionable reliability because the philosophers are basically given hagiographic stories. Aristotle's father was Nicomansus, who was a private physician to a Macedonian king, which is also kind of interesting because Aristotle has a tie to Macedon. The Macedonian king was Amyntas. At 17, Aristotle supposedly migrated to Athens and joined the academy to study under Plato for 20 years. And he was considered to have encyclopedic knowledge of the philosophical traditions and extensive interest in natural philosophy, or what we might call proto-science. Aristotle left Athens when Plato died. As a resident alien, he was excluded from citizenship, and the academy was given to Plato's nephew. There's also a counter theory here that Aristotle was forced to flee Athens because of anti-Macedonian sentiment as Philip of Macedon began expanding power and incursioning on various polises. Now, it's interesting that Plato focused on the polis, and so does Aristotle, given that the Macedonian political framework was not based on polises in the same way. While the Macedonians were arguably Hellenistic, they had kingdoms and traditional people bonds and something we might call a king or an ethnarch more than you had a stable polis with a constitution. Aristotle becomes employed by Philip of Macedon and famously is the tutor to Alexander the Great. So we have to have this for context for a discussion of politics because in this way, Aristotle has a more liminal relationship to Greek politics than Plato or any of the other classical Greek legal thinkers or political philosophers. After a long time in Macedon, when Athens was actually under Macedonian rule, Plato returned to Athens and rented buildings in the Lyceum, which became his school, which also kind of changed some of the things going on in the structure. We have something closer to an academy in the way we think about it, instead of just a collection of individuals who are responsible for each other's knowledge. You have a institution that has a physical building. It is assumed that most of the surviving texts are notes that he wrote for the curriculum at the Lyceum, and He operated it for 13 years and then departed from Athens a second time because there may have been charges of impiety brought against him, just like Socrates, and Aristotle didn't want to go down that way. Now, the corpus Aristoculum, which is the Latin name for the Library of Aristotle, was recorded lectures more than polemic completed works or dialogues, dialectics that you would see in Plato. These were hand copied and circulated all over Southern Europe and North Africa for many, many centuries. They are the Southern Europe are eventually kind of banned in early Christianity. They are maintained, however, as Aristotle is like the philosopher in the Islamicate Arab and North African world. And those Arab things are actually reintroduced. Those Arab copies of the corpus Aristotelium are reintroduced to the West by interactions with the Islamic world in Andalusia in Spain and in the Crusades. Now, there's a lot of stuff that's missing in Aristotle. We have several categories of text: logics, syllogistics, rhetorics, poetics, and political manuals. Natural philosophy, of which Aristotle was very dominant until basically the ascent of Darwin. But the political theory in Aristotle is a little complicated. So, for Aristotle, and I think a lot of liberals and conservatives both today have a kind of incomplete or folk theory of politics based on Aristotle, which is that politics exists to enable people to live their best life. Now, that's not a common definition of politics, but it is something that Aristotle would have believed. Aristotle believed that human beings had a teleology. How you knew your teleology was the thing which you could do as an organism that other people could not. Human virtues were all subject to the prime human virtue, which is our teleological purpose, because other animals could not do it, and that is reason. Now, we can contest Aristotle's assumption that reason is unique to humans or any of that. I mean, I don't know a single anthropologist today who would accept that, and many other comparative biologists wouldn't either. But this is the logic here. To subordinate the virtues, one lives in accordance with reason, and reasons thus back up the virtues because they emerge from the natural laws of the universe and the teleology of human beings who actualize themselves by doing what they are uniquely good at. And again, for Aristotle, that is reasoning. But reasoning for Aristotle has to be a social engagement. It is not something you just do on your own. While private contemplation is important, that is theoria in Aristotle, both practical knowledge and embodied knowledge require a social body for it to work. So to live in accordance with virtue requires ethics, but it also requires laws. Laws require political institutions, and the political institutions are based in these polises, which are urban areas, like I said, with metropolises and dominant cultures, and stated constitutions of which the laws and courts are based. And the reason why this public life is so important for Aristotle, later Hellenistic philosophies might actually even reject it, is that To enact virtue requires you to enact with other people. To show your virtue, your strength, requires you to model these values off of the people that you see, which requires you to be in contact with other people. Which means ethics for Aristotle is not reducible to politics, but ethics and politics for Aristotle are intimately related. Because if you kind of think of it this way, morality is about your internal motivations. Ethics is about your responsibility to others in a civil society. And politics is about the regulation of all these things under social interactions controlled by law. So a political community for Aristotle exists to bring about the virtuous life of his citizenry in accordance with their own natures. Now we can get into the problems of this, and the problems of this in Aristotle are highly debated and also well known. The Politica, for example, as I said, is not so much an integrated treatise, but a bunch of essays linked together, usually on the topic of the constitution of polises and different types of society. One of the things that Aristotle just assumes is that the city-state and the household are natural, and that the city-state is thus an extension of the household, just like politics becomes an extension of ethics. It can't be reduced to ethics any more than you can reduce the city-state to a household, but there is a way in which the patria, the patrida, and the fatherland, and the patriarch, the head of the household, are intimately tied together, not in Aristotle thinking, not just metaphorically, but literally. One is almost an extension and expansion of the other, which moves out in this particular way because that is how society has to be organized. But for Aristotle, this is natural, just as sui generis. Just like there's different kinds of people who naturally exist, including for Aristotle things like natural slaves. There are different kinds of city-states that naturally exist and would exist inherently. They're just assumed to be. There's no real prehistory of the polis, although other kinds of political considerations and the development of political communities are considered for Aristotle. And in fact, he has kind of a theory of the ideal and degraded types, which we'll get to in another video because it's super common. So Politica is a study of constitutions, which would imply something that we see in the Nicomachean Ethics, that political life is necessary for a virtuous life to be lived, and a virtuous life is necessary for reason to be enacted, and so reason must be enacted as a natural teleology of mankind. Therefore, for Aristotle, political life is a necessity. Now, it is highly debated on whether or not the Politica was ever intended to be a singular unified text, whether or not it is organized, and if there's an argument to the organization. There are similar debates over other Aristotelian texts. The Poetics is another one with similar debates, whereas things like the Analytics and the Nicomachean Ethics are much clearly unified treatises. So these are things to think about when talking about Aristotle's political agenda. And there's some key conceptions that we need to go over, which is why I went over both Aristotle's life, and remember, he is liminal to Greek political space. He's a cultural related insider, but from a powerful periphery that is distrusted in the Hellenistic polises. Now, Aristotle's word for politics is politica, which is short for politica episteme, excuse me. I am struggling with all these Greek terms, even how you pronounce them the English way. The politica episteme are political science or political knowledge. This is different from like politicae sophia, which is what he would basically accuse Plato of doing. So instead of going from first principles and dealing ideal states that are largely utopian. Aristotle thinks we should deduce these things from the functionality of actually existing political groupings and policies, which is why we should study constitutions of various city states when trying to figure out what a viable political science would be. And this mirrors Aristotle's approach to virtue and actually his approach to natural philosophy too. Remember, Aristotle thinks you should model virtue by finding paradigms of virtue, of which you can embody and watch and learn. Similarly, here he says that we should look at what the politics of these places do and how they justify those in law, and look at their long-term historic trajectories when dealing with politics, which is a different thing than the proposition of ideal norms. This tension between the utopian and the realist, are the normative and description, is a tension that goes all the way back in Western culture to Plato versus Aristotle on politics, and probably even way before that. It is in the Nicomachean Ethics where this political science is actually defined. And in fact, Aristotle goes on to say that political science is the most authoritative science because all sciences are studied within the city-state, thus and are studied for the maintenance of the city-state, such as the maintenance of military service, household management, rhetoric for public functions, ways to make good. Therefore, understanding the city-state would even be important for natural sciences. So we have a sociologicalization in modern terms, and with a word I just kind of made up, of knowledge, because understanding our political context for Aristotle is crucial for understanding everything else. So political science for Aristotle governs even the practical and natural sciences of the practical and natural forms of knowledge, because political science is about the collective maintenance of human good. So you can see how modern liberals might think that we should be virtuous and have virtuous ethics, and our ethics and our politics are basically one and the same. They probably would reduce into the same thing. After all, they seem to misunderstand the personal as political. But Aristotle sees this as a teleological development that is necessary. So we have two ethical works, the Nicomachean Ethics and the Eudemian Ethics. And these explain the principles that are set out in the politics. And I'll just shorthand them for you, and we'll start thinking about what this means. Happiness is the highest form of human good. Happiness is the activity of moral virtue defined in terms of the mean, and that justice or common advantage is a political good because it helps us to enact virtue, and thus virtue helps us to live reasonably, and thus living reasonably, we can enact our teleology, which will both make us happy, but also perform our role in the natural universe as prescribed to us by the natural universe's laws. So in Aristotle, there is a thin difference between the political and ethical. And in fact, there is barely a difference, which is why the political virtues are mentioned in the Nicomachean and Eudemian ethics. But what we can see here is that the Politica really is a specialized subset of the ethical. So again, even in Aristotle, they can't be said to be the same thing. So for Aristotle, and we'll probably end here, I don't want to overwhelm you. This is a lot more like one of my classes, if you ever wonder what taking a class with me is like, except I would have like discussion breaks every 5 minutes. Political science is what statesmen should do. All right. So political science, the knowledge or science of politics, the politicae episteme, is what statesmen should do in the way that medicine is what physicians should do. This is in Politics, book 4. All right. The most important task for the politician is the role of lawgiver, or nomothetes. which is what frames the constitution and thus the legal code of any given civil state. This involves laws, but also customs and formal institutions, including institutions for moral and natural education for all the citizens who can participate in political life. Now, remember, that's not everybody. All right. Once the act of law giving is done and a constitution is in place, for Aristotle, politicians have to take appropriate measures to maintain a constitution, including reforming that constitution when it is necessary. But the goal of reforming the constitution is that as things change or develop, you can basically keep the political developments of a system at relative homeostasis or expansion. So you're either staying the same or you're increasing. Thus, legislative work is the most important thing for Aristotle and his notion of politics, and it is far more important than politics is exercised in daily life or political court politics, or the way you handle the agora, the market and public square. And since this is an episteme, there's also a technique to it. So the politician for Aristotle is frequently compared to a specific kind of craftsman. Now, this is because Aristotle thinks that everything has four causes: the material cause, the formal cause, the efficient, and the final cause. And we can look at this in terms of a drinking cup, which is what in the physics and metaphysics Aristotle uses to justify this kind of ideal. So the material cause of a drinking cup is clay, which is molded into a cylindrical shape, which is its form, or the formal cause, by a potter, which is a moving cause, or the cause that actually makes the thing. And then it contains a beverage, which is its purpose, its teleological function, and thus its final cause. This is related to Aristotle's physics and metaphysics. But he thinks this is true for a community as well. So, how does he see these causes and play down in the community? Aristotle describes various contexts: households, economic classes. For him, there are two economic classes: the rich and the poor. Demes, which are lower level political movements, units that are polis, kind of like the way there's these metropoles, but these demes are like villages or local communities around them. And there's natural resources of which the city-state is built. So in this analogy, the formal cause of the city-state is the politia, or the constitution. All right, it is the ordering of the inhabitants of the city-state. It is its form, and it is a formal document. The community that forms the compound depends on the constitution, but it is the basis of the constitution. The existence of the city-state is its efficient cause, namely its ruler, which is what's going to be the most important to it. So basically, maintaining the formal order is going to be very important, and that requires everything together. The material causes the community which forms it. And a given territory, which is also a material cause. So the two material causes in Aristotle, the political form or the matter form, is the population in a territory. Now, this is different than a lot of other political groupings. A lot of other political groupings before the establishment of like medieval kingdoms were not political groupings of areas. They're political groupings of peoples. And I pointed this out before, like when Joseph Tainter points out the difference between King of the Franks and the King of France. One describes a more stable but more organized form of government. And the final cause of all this is the constitution of a formal city-state, which allows people to live in virtue with each other. That is the teleological function. These are the assertions of Aristotle. We can see a lot of modern thought in this is different from other political thinking. One, the role of constitutions is paramount in Aristotle in a way it's not in other political thinkers, even in Plato. Two, this, though, leads us to a problem. Which forms of constitutions actually are the most stable and enable the most virtue? Which is a question in which Aristotle devotes a lot of time. But we've been going for 30 minutes and we're not going to get into it today. Thank you. Like and subscribe. Hit the bell. There's always more behind the Patreon where I talk about all the other things. I'm going to get to those two other series I'm talking about. I'm going to get back to Varn and Bowman and Bowman's discussion on political violence. And I will also be starting a short mini series of lectures, kind of like this, on the various kinds of third worldism and anti-imperialisms as they've existed, because those are thrown around a lot and those theories need to be clarified. All right. When we come back, we'll talk about a general theory of constitution and citizenship for Aristotle and why this is important to him, and some other key things that will help you understand the way the ancients thought about politics and the way that both does and does not influence the way we talk about politics now. Take care. Protect your peace.